We're going to be going over the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium ATPase pump is a transmembrane protein that helps maintain a physiologic concentration of sodium and potassium in a cell. To do this, it uses active transport, meaning it uses ATP. Since ATP is produced inside the cell, it makes sense that the ATPase domain is on the cytosolic side of the protein. Remember, the inside of the cell is high in potassium and only has a little bit of sodium, whereas the outside of the cell is high in sodium and only has a small amount of potassium. Therefore, the role of the sodium-potassium pump is to bring potassium in and pump sodium out. Remember that 3-2 rule? 3 sodiums are transported out of the cell and 2 potassiums are transported in. I don't know about you, but I always had a hard time remembering which direction the sodium went and which direction the potassium went, in or out, and I always had to stop and take a minute to think it through. However, your first aid book has a great way to remember this. Pumpkin, as in pump potassium in. If you remember that little phrase, you'll be solid. So let's say you have a cell and somehow the sodium-potassium pump isn't working. What do you think is going to happen? Well, first of all, sodium will start to accumulate in the cell since you're unable to pump it out, and whenever sodium concentration increases anywhere, water is going to follow it, since water follows salt. The cell can swell and can eventually lyse due to osmotic stress. So this pump is really important in all cells, but there are 2 cells where sodium-potassium pump works extremely hard. And can you think of these 2 cells that I'm referring to? One would be neurons, since every time an action potential goes down the axon, they need to repolarize a cell. And another would be muscle cells, since even though they're dependent on the calcium concentration, the sodium-calcium translocator uses a sodium gradient to remove calcium from the intercellular space. Since sodium wants to flow into the cell, and you can use that energy to push calcium out. The sodium-calcium exchanger, by the way, does not use ATP because it operates via passive transport. There are a few drugs that inhibit this pump. Ouabain is a plant-derived toxic substance that is traditionally used as an arrow poison in East Africa for both hunting and warfare. Like other plant-based toxins, it looks completely harmless, which you can see in this image here. The poison could be extracted from the branches and leaves of the plant by boiling them over a fire, and is fatal by its high-potency inhibition of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. Eventually, it was industrialized, and scientists identified ouabain as a glycoside and believed, at low doses, that it could be used to treat cardiac conditions. Cardiac glycosides are drugs used for atrial fibrillation and congestive heart failure. Digoxin and digitoxin fall under this category. These drugs directly inhibit the sodium-potassium ATPase pump and cause an increase in sodium inside the cell. This indirectly results in the inhibition of the sodium-calcium exchanger. So digoxin inhibits the sodium-potassium ATPase, and that directly inhibits this pump, and this ultimately increases the concentration of calcium in the cell. Increased calcium means more troponin C and calcium binding, which, if you recall, allows for myosin and actin cross-bridge formation and the generation of tension and overall increased cardiac contractility in cardiomyocytes. In addition, digoxin also decreases conduction at the AV node and depresses the SA node, which helps treat atrial fibrillation. One question I frequently saw in exams was how digoxin affected heart rate. You might think digoxin increases heart rate since it increases cardiac contractility and the heart is overall working harder, right? But it actually decreases heart rate, and this is by vagal nerve stimulation. If you recall, the parasympathetic nervous system, or our rest and digest nervous system, is innervated by vagal stimulation, so stimulating the vagus nerve will result in lowered heart rate. I can almost guarantee you will see a question on this on your board exam. Side effects of digoxin include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, blurry yellow vision, arrhythmias, AV block, and hyperkalemia, since you get a buildup of potassium in the plasma. However, hypokalemia can lead to chronic digoxin toxicity, and this is because digoxin binds to the potassium binding site on the sodium-potassium ATPase. So when potassium levels are low, digoxin can easily bind to the ATPase pump, exerting greater effects. Antidotes to digitoxin toxicity include slowly normalizing potassium levels, cardiac pacers, anti-digoxin Fab fragments, and magnesium. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, give a thumbs up.